Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda McKenzie. I'm the CEO of the Climate Council, Australia's independent community-funded climate organisation. And our job, as you may know, is to bring evidence-based climate information to the public, to decision makers, and to push for strong solutions. So I'm really glad that you could be here tonight with this conversation with my old friend, colleague, and co-founder of the Climate Council, Tim Flannery, who I'm sure is very familiar to all of you. But before I begin, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on tonight. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to country and the tens of thousands of years of knowledge about living with this land, not against it, which is a theme that runs through some of tonight's conversation. So I invite you all to share the land that you're joining us from today, and we can get a bit of a picture where everyone is coming from. So the way that the webinar will work tonight, we've collected a whole lot of pre-submitted questions that I've woven through what I will talk to Tim about tonight. But as always, please jump in the chat, add your questions and thoughts, but of course keep them constructive and respectful. We also, fortunately, have Dr. Martin Rice, who's our Director of Research, and he will be manning the Q&A box today. So if you've got additional questions, that will complement the webinar as well. And we'll also drop links in the chat as we go through where there are relevant pieces of additional content, but rest assured that that will be emailed to you afterwards as well to follow up. So just to introduce Tim, as I said, I know he's very familiar to all of you, but as a reminder, Tim is one of the best known Australian scientists and science communicators. He's a paleontologist, he's an explorer, he's an author, and many of you would know, as I mentioned, he is one of the co-founders of the Climate Council back in 2013. So he spent decades at the centre of the climate conversation here in Australia, but also around the world, and still spends much of his time in the field, most recently in New Guinea, which if we have time, we'll get into as well. So the reason we're here though today is that he's just recently published a new book called Climate Folly with his daughter, Emma Flannery, who is also a scientist, writer, communicator. So Tim, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks for that great introduction. And thank you, Martin, for manning the question box. I'm calling in from Dharawal country, and I'm very much looking forward to engaging with everyone. We've got a huge number of people. I've just been looking at where everyone's come from. We've got people from Scotland, from all over the world, it looks like. So that's fantastic.
Thanks, Tim. Well, we'll jump straight into it. And I thought, given it's actually 20 years this year since I've been working on climate change. And the thing that got me into it was this book. I'll just put it in the shot, The Weathermakers, which you wrote a bit over 20 years ago. And I thought we should reflect first before we get to the new book, that book that was so influential on me, on many people around the world. When you look back now over those 2 decades, how the science, the politics, the public conversation has changed, where do you reflect on where progress has been made?
Wow, well, that's a great question, Amanda. And I think back in 2004, when that book was being written and published, we understood the problem. The scientists, the third assessment report was just about to come out, 2005. We understood the problem, we understood what the solutions were in theory, but we didn't have the capacity to do very much. So back then, the first gigawatt scale solar PV factory, for example, was built in China in 2010, or reached that scale in 2010. So we just, we had the inspiration, but we didn't have the means. And when I look back now where we are today in 2026, not only do we have enough manufacturing capacity to make solar, the number one energy resource around the world, and wind. But we have the electrification of transport's well advanced. The last quarter of last year in China, 25% of all of the heavy duty trucking rigs, the really big ones, were electric. So it's a massive step forward. So I think we have most of the technology now, most of the capacity required, manufacturing capacity to deliver that technology quickly and around the world. But we still don't have a common view that that's what's needed. And that is what's holding us up.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you look backwards, isn't it? And think about how far we've come. It is pretty amazing. Like that I've looked back at that year and there was a few thousand panels on roofs, and now there's more than 4 million households with panels on their roof this year. It's pretty phenomenal change.
Oh, it really is. I remember flying. I used to live in Adelaide back then, and I'd fly in, and there'd be one little solar panel there and another one there. And every time there was a new one, I thought, "Yay, this is great!" And
Yeah, now they're everywhere.
yeah, we couldn't see that, where it was going to go and how quickly that would happen in Australia. That is a fantastic outcome.
And I vividly remember the week that we started the Climate Council back in 2013, which was a bit of a whirlwind. People may remember it was a challenging time for climate action. We had been at the Climate Commission, which was abolished by Tony Abbott. And so the Climate Council had risen out of the ashes of the Climate Commission, and Abbott was elected with a platform to scuttle action. And at that time, when we founded the Climate Council, you said to me, if we're going to do this, it has to be fun.
Yeah.
And I keep remembering that at times because it's obviously there's a lot of ups and downs when you're working on this. How have you kept it fun over the years?
Well, that's been my motto with, working with people anywhere, because we know how hard it's going to be, Amanda. You and I, through experience, know it's going to be incredibly difficult, demanding, and just, sometimes very, very hard to keep going. So we have to make it fun for each other. There's no alternative, we have to celebrate the wins. We have to do all the things you need to do to keep inspired and keep moving. So that has been my motto really through life. When I was running a museum, it was the same thing, and the Climate Council and whatever else I've done, it has to be fun. Otherwise, you won't have the endurance, to complete
Mm.
the task.
I think many people coming onto the conversation today will have been reading the news about what's been happening in the Northern Hemisphere over the last few weeks and months. And obviously, there's been some harrowing climate extremes, the extreme heat across North Africa, Europe, North America, followed by fires. And I think they're very reminiscent of the Black Summer fires in Australia and the sort of step change that we're seeing in the fire regimes in other places in the world that we have also seen in Australia in terms of the ferocity and the damaging nature of those fires. So we are having to reckon with the fact that although we have spent decades working on the issue, and there has been these big global shifts in renewable energy and electrification of transport, etc., we haven't done enough. Climate pollution is still too high, global temperatures have risen, the climate has destabilised. So that's kind of where I wanted to start the conversation in terms of your latest book. When you were working on the weather makers, you were warning about some of these things that have now come to pass. So, what motivated you to then approach this new book, Climate Folly?
I've watched year after year as emissions have not only stopped growing, but I mean they're just climbing. 2025 was the highest level of emissions, right? So we haven't yet reached the peak. Hopefully this year we will have, but we haven't. So, we see the problem, but we are just way too slow to act. And, a decade ago, I started getting very interested in drawdown technologies because I could see that we had to do something additional. In addition to reducing our emissions, there was so much pollution in the air that we needed a new tool. And so planting forests, looking at storage, rocks for storing CO2 and so forth, I scoped that out. And we've now moved on again where we can see that both emissions reduction and drawdown technologies together won't be enough to keep us safe from these very dangerous changes. And so, very reluctantly, I've started looking at what the geoengineers are telling us. I thought the best way to deal with this is really to go back and have a look at a long history of geoengineering attempts around the planet. And you can tell from the title of the book that I haven't been very impressed with the quality of a lot of what's been done. But we do have to grasp a nettle at some point. We've got to start at least assessing some of these options because otherwise we will go into climate territory which it could threaten the stability of our species.
Mm. And I think as you approach the book, it's clear that you've got sort of three ways of categorizing the approaches to tackling the climate crisis. There's the one that we're all very familiar with, that we need to cut climate pollution very steeply. We should have been doing it more quickly in the past, but from now, cut it very steeply and deeply. And then the second one, as you mentioned, drawdown, drawing pollution out of the air. And then the third one, geoengineering, which are technologies that people hope will cool the planet. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about each one of those things.
Yeah.
And so, for all of us that are kind of getting our heads around it, how you define each of those categories.
Sure. Well, look, let's start with just stopping the pollution, right? At the moment, the cheapest solutions for pulling, CO2 out of the air are probably about $100 a ton. So isn't it better to not put that in and have to commit yourself to spending $100 than to put it in and then think, oh, sometime we'll get it back down? So it is such a no-brainer to reduce that pollution stream now. We have every tool we need. They're available. We should be going through every industry, every source of pollution and starting to cut as much as we can because it will save us trillions in the future. And that's just common sense. As far as drawdown goes, they are they're perfect technologies in a sense because what they do is allow us to assist nature to deal with the problem. So a good example of that is growing forests, Amanda. Trees are made of carbon drawn from the air. And we know we can do that at scale. In fact, China has increased its forest cover from I think about 6% to 18% over the last 20 years. And that's been a huge contribution. Globally, the replanted forest and the managed forests that we're looking after are drawing down about 2 gigatons of pollution a year. Now, that's really good news, but we're putting up in excess of 40 gigatons a year. So you can see that it's not going to be enough. Even if we do 50% more, 100% more, trees start small. They don't start drawing a lot of carbon out till they get bigger. And we just don't have a lot of other technologies that are scalable. Everything else is at a really pretty rudimentary scale in the drawdown area. So geoengineering is the third option we have, and it's kind of like putting a band-aid on a wound without putting the antiseptic on first, in the worst case, It covers up the problem. So it doesn't deal with the problem, it covers it up. A good example is this proposal to put sulfur into the stratosphere to just cool the planet. Now, the CO2 will continue to be emitted, the oceans will acidify, we'll have all of those problems, but the planet won't warm as much. So you can see why people aren't, have approached this cautiously, these geoengineering proposals. But honestly, we are now getting to the point where we probably need some sort of combination of all three of those approaches if we want to stabilize the climate in our lifetimes.
Mm. And I think the word coming to these reluctantly is interesting because I think as you've explored these technologies over the last 10 years, whether it's from a cost perspective or whether it's from, a desirability, it is the best thing to do is to stop the problem at the source and
Yeah.
to reduce our climate pollution rapidly. But what you're arguing in the book is that things are now progressing very quickly, as the Northern Hemisphere summer is evidenced by. And what we will experience in the next 20, 30 years is pretty, could be very extreme. So I think that's the motivation seems to be coming at these additional technologies. It's not at all giving up the imperatives to slash emissions. It's saying, what are the additional things?
No, that would be a disaster if we gave up cutting emissions on the hope that some geoengineering approach might save us. That's madness. We need all three, but they've got to be carefully considered, optimized. The easiest one's just reducing the pollution stream. We know how to do
Mm,
that. You can buy an EV tomorrow if you want here in Australia. You can, put solar panels on your roof. We can all do what's needed. Um, and the drawdown, yes, we can perhaps we can increase that by 50%, but that still leaves a big deficit, and that deficit's going to
mm.
have to be covered somewhere.
And I love the way that you approached these topics in the book. You went back in time and had a look at historically how have humans tried to change the climate in lots of different ways all around
Mhm.
the world. Many bizarre, many entertaining, many pretty
Yes.
horrifying.
Yeah.
Talk us through a couple of the stories that might have made you laugh or cringe or maybe both.
Sure. Well, look, I should say that, if you go back far enough, it's all kind of very mystical approaches, appealing to God, like the prophet Elijah appealing, to God for rain in its season and so forth. And that continues probably right through to the present. We've had some very interesting examples here. I remember during the millennial drought, there was a group of ladies who decided to dance naked at a secret location in the Mallee in the hope of bringing rain. But, you know, it's probably good for the soul. I don't know what it does in terms of bringing more rain. But that all changed really with the 20th century, and we as a species gained enough industrial capacity and enough knowledge about the climate system to start really thinking about how we might change the climate globally. Um, and there were some horrific things done. I mean, in the 1930s, the Germans, or particularly a German called uh, Hermann Sorgel, decided that perhaps we could avoid all future wars and make a rosy future for humanity by draining the Mediterranean basin. So, the vision was to put a dam across the Pillars of Hercules. One of Germany's most eminent architects designed a 400-meter high tower to ornament this great dam. Uh, Hitler gave the book an endorsement on the cover.
Oh
And the
my
vision
gosh.
was that, we'd drain the Mediterranean and it'd all be this fantastic amount of Lebensraum for everyone. There'd never be another war because we'd have all this space. And the Africans surely would be happy to work for us for a pittance as we did this. And we could generate enough hydroelectricity from the dam to give everyone, light and power and everything else. Um, but, the plan was so kind of huge that it really was unfeasible, thank God. And there were a few people who were questioning it. Someone wrote to Mr. Sergel, said, but what will happen to the canals of Venice? And he said, we will have special measures in place to deal with that. And so, but the whole thing was
That's
going to be,
wild, isn't it?
but that went on, it survived the war, that plan. UNESCO ended up sort of adopting it. And there was, until the 1960s, people were talking about this as a serious proposal. It beggars belief, but there you go. And
And
look,
it does,
if I could go on, Amanda, there's some
yeah.
other terrible ones. You know, the both the Soviet government and the American government, with the discovery of nuclear weapons, really thought, oh, this is great. Perhaps we could improve the climate by blowing up the Arctic ice cap. And, one of the head of the Weather Bureau in the US said we only need 10 hydrogen bombs and we could get rid of the whole thing. So and there was
And
one. I don't know whether
some of the
people.
reactions that you said in the book on that, oh, well, it might cause tidal waves or it might do this or might do that, reminds me how some of the AI proponents say, oh, there's a 10%, 20% chance of destroying humanity, as
Exactly.
if
It's sort
that's an
of,
okay thing to say.
and in the middle of all this, no one had thought about like the sea level rise. It wasn't until the 1970s that people understood if you melt all that ice, the sea's going to rise, right? And have a
Mm,
big impact on things. But I think just I'll just give you one more story that tells you a little bit about it. Did people see that little image at the start of the talk? The guy with the levers and the machine, Irving Langmuir, his name was, and he decided that he said after the Second World War, weather war is going to be much more important than any other kind of war. He said I can actually alter the weather, global weather, to disadvantage Russia and advantage North America. And he had President Eisenhower's ear for this type of stuff. And in 1947, actually, he was given control of these great big B-52 bombers and things, and decided to wait for a hurricane to intensify off the American coast and to bomb it with dry ice and dissipate it or change its course. So there was this hurricane which was actually heading away from the coast at the time. His bombers bombed it with dry ice. It abruptly turned around and slammed straight into Savannah, Georgia. So, so there was huge court case about this. Professor Langmuir was very lucky that some meteorologist discovered that in 1907 another hurricane had followed the same path, rather unusual path, and so the case wasn't found against him. But we know today that in fact nothing he did could have affected that hurricane at all, right? It's just
mm,
pure coincidence and good luck, like with a lot of this type stuff. But the court cases that came about are a real warning to us as we go into geoengineering. Imagine if a country did decide to undertake some geoengineering proposal, and at the same time there was an adverse weather effect. You know, it who knows where it would end up. But I'm as worried
mm,
about that as I am about some of the proposals themselves.
mm. And I think that's why this is it's a nuanced book and it's a nuanced conversation, because it's not the conversation you want to have. We would prefer to have solved the climate crisis rather than have to get to these additional measures and solutions. There's also one of the questions from Linda reminded me of, you mentioned in the book as well, some of the Australian examples about turning rivers inland, that sort of zombie idea that comes up
Mm.
over and over again, pushed by some politicians, that has never made any sort of ecological sense. So there's many examples around the world and here too. And
Mm.
I think it reflects that human beings have always sought to control the climate one way or another. But as you say in the book, the tools now are much greater. And we're obviously conducting this huge global experiment, which you talk about in the book, which is climate change, which is raising global temperatures through burning enormous amounts of climate pollution. So, as you've talked about geoengineering solutions that could be options to cool the climate either locally or globally. And so, given the history of climate folly that you go through in the book, the ways that it can go wrong, why do you think we need to explore those sorts of technologies?
Well, look, I've come to the regrettable conclusion, really, that things are now we face such an immense difficulty in stabilizing the climate, that I can imagine that we will lose our coherence as a species and start to collapse into warfare and, unimaginably large problems for our species if we face mass starvation or, huge changes to the climate that are just making life impossible. So, rather than just that, I think we owe it to ourselves to rationally assess some of these proposals that are being put forward. The alternative is, of course, to do nothing and just let a trillionaire do it. And at the moment, the only permissions you need to do a geoengineering project in the US, to put sulfur in the stratosphere or whatever, is to give 10 days notice to the US government, and then you can do whatever you want. And these projects, they might be in the low billions in terms of cost, but there's now a trillionaire on the planet, and
Mm.
he's Elon Musk has given up on Earth and wants to go to Mars. So, the danger is real.
He's welcome to it.
Exactly. Well, he'd like other people to go first, I think.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of times this idea of stratospheric aerosol injection.
Hmm.
Can you tell us what that is? And then what would be the potential pros and cons? What research is out there already on this technology?
Sure. Look, this idea of stratospheric sulfur has been around for quite some time now, probably at least 50 years. And the idea really was seeded by people looking at the impact of volcanoes on the Earth. And we know that when there's a large volcanic eruption with the right sort of rocks that releases sulfur into the stratosphere, the Earth cools. So now back in 1816, when the Tambora volcano erupted in Indonesia, there was, 3 years without a summer, effectively. So the Earth was cooled. So people have studied and modeled what happens when volcanic eruptions put sulfur into the stratosphere, and we understand that quite well. But we don't know what happens if we deliberately put sulfur up there, say by adding sulfur to jet fuel for flights that are going across the Arctic. Or for people, there's a startup wants to just put balloons, helium balloons up there to float up and, send sulfur up. And in fact, that group were sending balloons up from Mexico and selling what's called cooling credits, which are just mumbo jumbo. Um,
Mm.
which is, one of the problems we face with this. People are going to try to make money out of it or make a reputation out of it. Um, so that's the problem is that the capacity's there, right? It's not that expensive to put a little bit of sulfur in the jet fuel of aircraft, right? But the consequences of that are really unknown. No, we just have not done the computer modeling to understand what that might entail. Because the Earth system, it's interconnected and telekinetic,
Mm.
the climate system. It's incredibly complex and dynamic. And just to think we could put sulfur up there, yes, we might cool a planet, but what else will it do? Will it cause, for example, a failure of the monsoon in India? Or if we do it and then there is a unrelated failure of the monsoon in India, how will the Indians react to the people who've done that? Because we don't have a global agreement to do any of this. So it's just highly dangerous. And, the book really calls for two things. One is a better regulatory environment so we can actually control some of these groups that want to do this. And secondly, a really renewed emphasis on research so that we
Mm,
can understand more fully which of these proposals have some merit and which don't.
yeah. Well, let's get back into that research and governance in a little bit. I want to explore a few more of the technologies to give people a picture of what is out there and what people are thinking about. One that's been explored in Australia is called marine cloud brightening, and it's designed to cool waters underneath those clouds and then can potentially reflect more sunlight. Of course, we've got glaciers melting and ice caps melting, which means that there is less reflectivity from the earth than we have had previously. There's other factors in that too. So this is about creating more reflectivity. Tell us about that technology again. What do we know about the pros and cons? What do we know about the research?
Well, that cloud brightening at an early stage is going on right now in Australia over the Great Barrier Reef, and it's being funded by our tax dollars. So, people are not aware this is a geoengineering proposal that's happening here at home. Um, so what it involves is people pump seawater into the atmosphere through and create particles of a particular size, which is really important. Hope that those particles then waft up to the upper troposphere where the clouds are, and then precipitate or act as nuclei for a particular sized water droplet, which gives cloud additional brightness, which then reflects light away from the surface of the Earth. So sunlight hits those bright clouds and is reflected away, so the area under the cloud stays cooler. You know, it, in my basic understanding of all of these technologies, that's one which has less downside than others. But, do we really know? If I was have to tell you hand on heart that this was not going to have any adverse impacts, I couldn't do it because we haven't done the modeling. So, you know, it might save the Great Barrier Reef, it might cool the waters of the reef lagoon, but, what else? What other consequences will it have?
And this is the point on research, isn't it? Like, let's try and really understand the downstream consequences as we investigate, which there is, as you said, public research into that particular project, which is really useful. When you look at the range of geoengineering solutions that are out there, are there particular ones that if I gave you a bucket of $100 million tomorrow, what would you want to spend time researching?
Look, I wouldn't research one particular outcome. I would use it to try to build that coalition of global regulatory environment and try and give it to a research institution that could at least do a first cut at looking across these technologies. I mean, the US Academy of Engineering and Sciences has produced an overview of the technologies, and the Royal Society in the UK has done a similar thing in recent years. So we've had the kind of start of scientific interest, if you want, in some of these things, but we are not yet focused in a way we need to be in terms of assessing these technologies. And given the frightening pace of climate change, I fear that it won't be long before people will start reaching for these technologies. And, I'm not saying this about any particular technology, but there are a lot of charlatans out there. There are a lot of people who just want to make money. That's their first I think. And there are others, there are, very, very wealthy people who act probably with good intentions, but believe that they can solve the problem. So, I've heard George Soros, wonderful man in many ways, but he talks about stratospheric sulfur as a way of helping the planet. And there are other very wealthy people out there who do the same thing. So if one of them just decides that they're going to do it, there will be consequences.
Mm. So, as you're getting to, we've one thing that was really interesting across the stories in your book about historical and contemporary motivations is it does illuminate to a degree aspects of human nature. that, as you said, the task can attract charlatans, megalomaniacs, but it can also attract problem solvers that are trying to make the world better. And so for us as people kind of looking at these technologies, it's so important to have that research to an evaluation by the institutions that you've described and others to allow us to try and make sense of it all. But it seemed like the clear warning in the book was to be aware of people that are attracted to grandiose schemes that could be climate folly. Beware of those motivated by fame and fortune or power versus those motivated for actually tackling the large scale problem of climate change. And, there's obviously an overlap there as
Yeah.
well. But
Mm.
there is what struck me was that the people who have advanced a range of solutions in the past have been predominantly Western, powerful, wealthy men that have advanced schemes and not been particularly cognizant or caring about who might be downstream. So it again goes to your point about a global governance arrangement where many different people that will be impacted by any particular technology have a role.
Yeah, look, you're right. It's what amazes me as I've gone back through time is how limited the view of many of the proponents of geoengineering have been. There was a guy called Abbott who was a president of the US Society of Engineers in the 1920s who wanted to burn all the world's coal. He said, if we could get up to 3,000 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, we could be growing bananas in New York City. How great would that be? Like, but not thinking about the rest of the world. What happens to people around the equator? Just kind of this incredibly limited view that people have, and continue to have about this. And I guess that, limited view runs all the way through to just outright self-interest, which is where the charlatans are and
Mm,
that group. I mean, one of the big problems as well is that some of these technologies may be okay. Maybe they'll do what they're intended to do. But the question is, are they scalable and at what price? So you may have seen in the media recently, Amanda, that there's a startup which is looking at um, taking salt water and putting it on the Arctic ice cap during winter to increase the thickness of the ice cap. And it was,
mm,
I think, a couple of weeks ago that the initial results came out, and it actually works. But is it scalable? Right? They've done it over a few hundred square meters, I think, not very
mm,
much more. So what are the cost of doing that, and is it scalable and is it sustainable? So these are some of the questions beyond just the adverse impacts that we need to start looking at
mm.
as we examine these technologies.
Yeah. And I think that the acknowledging that the potential cost and scalability and potential downside, you're also saying, well, there may well be significant upside. So let's do the investigation. So I think that point about applying scientific rigor to whether it's a downstream effects or the cost or all of the other factors to any experimentation with the climate is really important. So it's a question of who does the investment. Like there are, as you said, a number of wealthy people around the world that are very interested in this, and that can be really great, but it can also have problems, of course. And you argue there's an important role then for government and international bodies in regulating the research and deployment of those technologies. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that regulation should entail?
Sure. Look, we need expert advice on a lot of these particular technologies, and I I say this with some reluctance, but the scientific community has not been as proactive as it could have been in terms of providing that advice. And I think part of the reason for that is they don't want to uh, give credibility to some of these proposals by investigating them. And the people are fearful that what we'll be creating as a sort of get out of jail free card for the polluting industries by giving it that credibility and saying perhaps we should go ahead with some of these approaches or investigate them further at least. But the alternative to me at least is far worse. To let the charlatans and the poor, the technologies that may bring more trouble than they're worth, continue to attract funding and development and support from government could be a catastrophic thing. And can I just point to one more thing? People, I find this hard to believe. So, in the 1980s, the Russians decided that we needed a second moon, and that second moon could bring sunlight over Russia and save on people's power bills and help crops to grow longer and all the rest of it. Now, it sounds like a mad idea, right? And when there was a failure with the Mir space station that stopped some of the satellites being released, so they only created a 5 kilometre array of light to do this, just an experimental thing. I thought that sort of thinking was dead. But the week before last, I read that the Trump administration has just endorsed a proposal by a group of California tech bros to create a second moon and sell the extra light to farmers so they can grow their crops longer. I mean, this is the we're kind of some of the stuff we're looking at. This is not like 30 years ago. This is now.
And is that ecologically, do the crops benefit from that? Like, is it like a summertime all the time, or is it detrimental
I don't think anyone has
ecologically?
any idea, Amanda. I'm totally flummoxed by it. But there's money going into this. This is now a startup that's spending money on creating this second moon. I think part of it is that maybe we've got the capacity to build rockets and satellites, and people are looking for a use for that stuff. You know?
Mm.
But I think it's total madness, obviously unnecessary, and who knows what consequences that would have for anything from bird migration through to the local ecosystem,
Oh,
human sleep
gosh.
patterns. I don't even want to think about it, but it's kind of like it seems to me that absolutely insane.
It's a laugh or cry sort of situation, isn't it?
Well, it
Um,
is. The whole book has been full of that. It's in fact the only climate book I've written, Amanda, which has made me laugh about as much as it's made me cry. So.
well, talking about governments that are being proactive, the UK seems to have been the most proactive on this. They have a publicly funded, it's called the ARIA program, which is
Yeah.
R&D funding into solutions that can unlock technological breakthroughs. And this is one of the areas that it's focused on.
Mm,
And that's then obviously housing R&D within a government rather than it being just in the private sector.
mm,
Australia has some of that sort of similar scenario for clean energy. We've got ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporations, two
mm.
government funded bodies that can develop and deploy technology. Should we be doing a concerted effort as a nation into doing research and development of these technologies? And what can we learn from what the UK has done?
Well, the answer is yes to both of those, Amanda. I think that right now the CEFC, for example, does get proposals for funding passing across its desk that lies somewhere between drawdown and geoengineering. You know, and I suspect that they are struggling, as many of us are, to assess those those kind of projects. Um, yes, we do need something, but we need something kind of big. And I must say, the middle powers, I think, are probably the best positioned to start to work as a group, like the UK, Australia, European Union, other countries, to start developing this capacity. Because, quite frankly, the big countries suffer from a level of megalomania that makes them more likely to be in the geoengineering space than,
And
um,
deploy it themselves and those sorts
yeah,
of things, isn't
exactly.
it?
So the
Mm.
US, Russia, and China are all doing that. It's interesting. China's had three what you might call geoengineering projects. Recently, there was the attempt to grow this massive forest area and stop the aridification of China. That's been a success. I think it's something like 66 billion trees being planted, but
Gosh.
that's massive scale.
That's the Great Green Wall in China, is that right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But then there's also this incredible geoengineering project to move water from south to north that has three major elements. The two lesser ones have now been built, but the big one is still being built. And this is going to be a century-long project to move water at a massive scale. The third one that they wanted to do was to create a great aerial river, and they were going to use cloud seeding to create rainfall across a whole band of China and bring rain through. And that's failed dismally because cloud seeding, it doesn't work in a functional sense. It may increase rainfall very minimally, but it's more about political theatre than it is about delivering results.
Mm. And we've talked quite a bit about geoengineering, which can be quite a grab bag of different technologies. And as you said, the can be a whole range of different potential downsides and upsides, and it's quite a complicated group of technologies to sort
Yeah.
of put together. The other group that we haven't talked about as much is the drawdown technologies. So those technologies that we try and get carbon out of the air. And the original and the best was vegetation and
Yeah.
trees, of course. And that the land sector is really important, of course, in getting carbon out of the air.
Mm.
I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the other solutions that exist in that space and whether there is investment going in to drawdown as it is into geoengineering.
Sure. Yeah. Look, because of the limits to growing forests on land, a decade or so ago, I was very interested in seaweed because the oceans are large and seaweed grows fast. And, we can sequester quite a lot of carbon using seaweed. I still think that's the case, but it's not proved practical to scale up from where we are now to a much larger carbon capturing system. And partly that's because, to sequester the carbon that seaweed captures, you've essentially got to throw it away. You've got to put it into the ocean deep, or you can't just use it for a crop, right? You've got to actually put that carbon somewhere. So there's that. There's the use of rocks, silicate rocks, which is, I think, again, promising. And the idea is that there's certain kinds of rocks, when they're exposed to the atmosphere, they bind with CO2 and create carbonates. And that can work at quite a large scale. Some of the most high quality silicate rocks, a kilogram of the rock can sequester a kilogram and a half of CO2. So, there's potential there. But at the moment, most of our mining is done with burning fossil fuels. So it's kind of, and it's got to be transported, of course. And if we're burning fossil fuels to transport that carbonate, then that's another loss. So we perhaps in a future world where we've decarbonised transport and decarbonised mining, we might look at that and say perhaps we can use these silicate rocks to draw some CO2 out of the air. And that is part of obviously Earth's natural system. It's limited at the moment by the rate at which those rocks are exposed and weather. But if we mine,
Mm,
we can accelerate that rate or enhance that rate.
mm. And one of the big challenges, of course, in the land sector is around offsets. And you talk about offsets in the book, and it's an important one because for many reasons, but
Mm.
also for Australia, that the safeguard mechanism is being reviewed this year. And the safeguard mechanism is the key fossil fuel policy in Australia to regulate the big fossil fuel polluters. And at the moment, we found in our modelling that fossil fuel pollution from industry is increasing when that policy is supposed to be designed to reduce pollution from that sector. And that's partly because of the offset regime,
Mm.
that companies are able to buy too cheaply too many offsets from the land sector. Can you illuminate for people what the carbon cycle is and why
Yeah.
a fossil fuel molecule of carbon is not the same as something from the land sector?
Sure. Well, look, the proposal at the moment with these offsets is that industry is entitled to dig up carbon which has been sequestered in the crust of the earth for, 1 to 200 million years, very securely, and would have stayed there for another couple of 100 million years, most likely, if it hadn't been extracted. And to then say, oh, well, to offset that, what we'll do is pay for some trees to be planted or some other way of, storing carbon in the biosphere. Now, the trouble is that, of course, that carbon in the tree will only be there as long as the tree's alive. And in the face of climate change, certainty about, what's happening to forest is, given the fires we're seeing at the moment and so forth, that carbon's not as securely stored. So, in a real world, you would think we'd be saying, well, we'll have a discount for that. You can put 1 ton up there, but you've got to buy 100 tons in the trees, right? To kind of give some balance. In fact, it's gone the opposite way. And that's simply because the fossil fuel industry is powerful enough to pervert these ideas and to use them for their own profit. And so I think we just have to do more. We can't have this fig leaf of offsets sitting there as an excuse for not cutting emissions faster and harder. We somehow need to deal with that problem.
Mm. And what we've argued with our proposal around the safeguard is that it should be used predominantly for sectors that are really hard to reduce the emissions. That was the the theory around offsets initially, anyway, rather than you should never be just introducing new fossil fuels from the fossil fuel sector.
No.
It's just insanity to me. Um,
Well, it's the people who do that. It seems to me maybe they're a bit like Elon Musk. They think they can go somewhere else if things go bad on planet Earth. You know, and the whole idea of, for example, gated communities where many of these very wealthy people increasingly live. They think their medicines have to be produced somewhere, their food has to be produced somewhere. They're not islands, as John Donne said. No man is an island,
mm,
and yet they behave as if they are. So that insanity again has to just stop.
Well, hope that is the ultimate lesson for humanity to learn, isn't it, from the climate crisis, is just how connected we all are, which should be
Yeah.
obvious to all of us, but it's not as we insulate ourselves in little islands. I think for when I read the book, I sort of took away from it that there are that the core point is we need to slash climate pollution and we need to keep going, but it's not enough given how bad things are getting here and around the world. So we need to explore these solutions, whether it's taking carbon out of the air or whether it's geoengineering solutions. They're not what we would necessarily want to do if we were just starting from ground zero. You wouldn't start putting sulfur in the air, but we
No.
should investigate what some of these solutions are in with the view that humanity is going to be so severely impacted over time now
Mm,
and into the future. But it kind of keeps coming back to me of each of those solutions, as you said, there's a high cost,
mm,
there's a whole lot of research and development, scaling, etc. So that should all be investigated, and some of that technology may well need to be deployed. But it's a very strong case for continuing to not put pollution in the atmosphere in the first place, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It really is. We've been banging on about that for more than 20 years now, Amanda, and we have had some impact, but not enough. So I do think we need to look a bit more widely. And look, could I just give an analogy to the way I see it at the moment? I think we're in a position where we've had a festering sore on our body that we've treated very lackadaisically, a bit like the way we've treated the need to reduce fossil fuel emissions. And that has now developed into a very nasty infection, right? And it's become increasingly evident that we have to have an amputation, right? No one wants an amputation, right? No one wants to put sulfur in the atmosphere. But if realistically, if we're going to survive, we need to do that. And wouldn't you, if you're in that position, seek the best medical advice? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you be out there trying to get the best doctor and the best advice? And yet we not. We seem to be again going to some hocus pocus medical thing and say, oh, we'll try some geoengineering. Be like trying, Reiki or something. I don't know. But but yes,
And it
it's
is the
frustrating.
worry that people have is that these technologies would be grasped by governments or by individuals in after something terrible has happened, and it then has this motivation, I will grasp for a technology that is available or appealing at this particular point, rather it be a nuanced and systematic way of evaluating the technology and evaluating different technologies and their downstream impact. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, and
exactly.
through the chat, people have put lots of different ideas for all of the ways that we should be reducing pollution, from clean energy to electrification, land sector, dealing with our consumption, lots of different ideas, which are all really valid.
Mm,
Um, but I wanted to move to sort of where I felt that the book lands, because you do end on quite a hopeful note at the end, even though you've gone through quite some ups and downs of human history around this.
mm,
But it's a discussion about what is the moment that we're in, what does it require of all of us? And I drew out a question from Fadi, who asks, I'm the father of two small children. Like many climate conscious parents, I've got really bad eco anxiety at the moment. The
mm.
science and the projected damage on life is expected, that life is expected to endure, keeps me awake at night. How do you, Tim, cope with the thoughts and feelings? Is there hope? And that's come through in a whole range of questions about what gives you hope, or as Christiana Figueres puts it, how do you stay stubbornly optimistic?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a question that's been much on my mind, and whoever asked that question, thank you. I'm in a similar position in that I've just had my first grandchild, And when I thought my timelines were pretty long when I had children, but you know they get much longer when you have a grandchild, and you do think what is the world going to be like in 2100? And it's such a profoundly moral question, Amanda. I've yes, I do have hope and I have optimism, but I also have a belief in doing what I think is the right thing, and I think that money and power can poison us. And if we all thought a bit more like that, perhaps we'd have more of a chance of getting through this. Um, the other thing I've got to say, whoever asked that question, just we have to keep on having fun. We're in a hard fight. We won't get through it. We won't win unless we can enjoy life, support each other, love our children. Realize, yes, we'll all we'll all die one day, but in the meantime, let's make a difference in the world and let's have fun. And I think that's the philosophy we need.
Tim, I remember having a conversation with Clive Hamilton. Many people have read his books, and some of his books can get pretty depressing.
Mm.
And before I had my children, I asked him, if you were my age and in my position, would you have children? And he said, of course I would. And I said, I'm really surprised by that reaction. And he said, well, basically exactly what you're saying, Tim, that humanity, we have to invest in ourselves to continue. And we have to invest in the next generation and believe that we can solve the problems that are in front of us. And that is one of the things that does come through your book is humans are a species of problem solvers. We are
Yeah,
determined to fix even some of the people that you're talking about that had crazy ideas. They were determined to fix things and make them better.
that's
And
right.
if we
Yes.
we won't go down their ideas, but if we can get together and be rigorous about what the ideas are and as clear-minded as possible,
Mm.
that puts us in the best possible stead for those that come after us.
Yes. God, Amanda, when you mentioned Clive there, I thought you were going to talk about Clive Palmer. And I have this memory of the only Tesla in Australia getting profoundly dented when Clive went and sat on it. But anyway, it's another story.
That was a funny story.
It was
That
hilarious.
was the press conference with Al Gore and Clive Palmer outside Parliament with one of our friends' Teslas. And for those that have a Tesla, the front boot of the Tesla, there's nothing underneath the bonnet. It's just a gap. And so anyone leaning back on the Tesla, but at a press conference, you'd never want to accidentally sit on that boot and have it go concave and leave a butt shaped image, would you?
Probably sell for a fortune if it's still around that dent. But anyway.
Oh well, there's a lot of absurdity in this, Tim, and that was one of those incidents, wasn't it?
Well, it was. And, the only, I'll just say one more thing, Amanda. This book is full of men, the book I wrote. It's full of men who are used to ruling things, used to being able to, wave their hand and influence others, and get their way, whether it's in their family or others. And that old toxic world is the other great fight we have, Amanda, is to create that equality, sexual equality, equality across people, and get away from that old model, because that model of thinking, oh, I can do it all, I can fix it, is what's, the book is riddled with cases where that's just been the problem.
And that's part of the governance plan, isn't it, that you're suggesting is around rather than it being a few individuals and a few companies, this is about governments coming together. And
Yeah.
obviously, our multilateral system is under strain at the moment. But as you said earlier, with the middle powers like Australia that are democratic, we're stable, we've actually got a great opportunity in this space to be a leading country. And it's not necessarily, I think it will be hard to make the political case necessarily that our government should be engaged in this, but it's
Yeah.
really important.
Look, it is, but probably with the UN, back in just after the Second World War, it was hard for a case to be made that Australia should be part of that, and yet we end up with
Yeah.
ever running, yeah,
Yeah. And it's
first
a view of
president.
Australia that we can be a bit bigger, isn't it? It's always depressing to me when we get so insular as a country that it's just about
Yeah,
what happens here. We can have an important role globally.
yeah, I think
Well,
so.
Tim, thank you so much for that conversation. It's exactly what I hoped to have. It's being very honest about what the folly is, what are the risks, but being also very honest about what is the situation we face and why we need to explore the solutions that, or what could be solutions, and how we would regulate it, how we would fund it, and what the role for governments here and around the world will be. So I think you're always bringing a very optimistic but realistic pathway for where we need to go. And you've always got a view of the horizon issues. You were talking about this 10 years ago when no one really wanted to look at it at all. So thank you for your work on this, as well as your decades of work in climate. You can see all the hearts and claps, and our community loves you very much. So we're going to share the link to Climate Folly if you'd like to dive in. It's a book, as Tim said, laugh and cry, and great to support Tim and have a good read of that book. Please, after the session, we'll send an email to everyone so you can stay involved. The first thing in the email will be just the video, so you can share it with your friends and family if you like. There's also a competition, so some people will be lucky winners of Tim's book, so make sure you open the email. And then there's also a survey in there to see what you thought about the webinar. We're always looking to improve and provide you with the information that you'll find valuable. So keep an eye on your inbox. We're also going, as I mentioned, we've got a big campaign on the safeguard mechanism. It sounds very boring, and technically maybe it is, but it's very important in terms of how we'll regulate fossil fuel pollution in Australia. So we'll come back to you on that in August and talk about how we're going to fight that policy and a range of others that are coming up. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Tim, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks everyone for joining. It's been your questions have been fantastic. Thank you.